Well, thank you so much. I'm Shannon Van Sant, the business editor for SupChina. And as we know, the coronavirus is sweeping the world, and it's having a huge impact on students and their parents, teachers, and education as a whole. It's interrupting academic calendars and forcing faculty and students to stay at home. And this is happening in the midst of already worsening US-China ties, with some people saying we are already in or heading towards a new Cold War, with Chinese students, faculty, and tech companies under scrutiny in the United States, and over the last few years, greater curbs on free speech and academic independence in China. So what does this all mean for US-China educational ties? Here with me to discuss is Wenqi Yu. She's the head of global public policy at VIP Kid, one of the world's leading education technology companies. Previously, Wenqi oversaw Goldman Sachs's corporate philanthropy in Asia. She also worked in the US Department of State and the US Congress on China's civil society development and rule of law issues. She is currently a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, where her research focuses on Chinese technology companies' operations in the US. Also joining me from China is Dennis Simon. He's Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke University's Joint Venture Campus in Kunshan, China. Dennis also serves as one of Duke's thought leaders on innovation and higher education developments in contemporary China. Previously, Dennis served as Senior Advisor on China and Global Affairs in the Office of the President at Arizona State University. Thank you so much for joining us. So Dennis, let me start with you. Tell us a little bit about Duke's joint venture campus in Kunshan and your background in China.
Okay. Duke has one of the 9 Ministry of Education approved joint venture campuses, 3 US, 2 UK, Russia has one, Israel has one, and the rest are with Hong Kong universities. And these are special approved joint ventures that were allowed in order to bring some kind of new pedagogy and new way of thinking about higher education. The one with Duke is particularly focused on bringing liberal arts education into China. We have about 600 plus undergraduates, about 125, 130 graduate students. We also have 11 or 12 research centers that are active and in place, and we're growing. The numbers of students who are applying increases every year. Our composition of our student body is about 65% Chinese and 35% international, including students from 41 different countries right now around the world. And my own background is that I've been living and working in China on and off for almost 4 decades. I first came to China in 1981, the mainland. I actually went to Taiwan in 1977 and did a doctoral dissertation way back when on the development of the Hsinchu Science and Industry Park and looked at the development of high technology in Taiwan's economy. And ever since that, my research and my activity have focused on the development of science and technology in China. I also, in addition to my academic career, I've also spent about 7.5 years in management consulting. I was the general manager for Anderson Consulting before it became Accenture between 1998 and 2000. And I was the founding president of Monitor Group, the management consulting company that was initially founded by Michael Porter from Harvard University. And I'm one of these people that as a young college student got bit by the China bug. I started learning Chinese in the early 70s when everyone wondered why I would be doing that. And then all of a sudden, Nixon went to China and the game changed. And for the last 40 years, have been heavily engaged in 2 facets of cooperation with China: education and science and technology.
Let me follow up with you. Right now, the pandemic has spread to the United States, to many other parts of the world, and I know that that students and teachers and faculty are wondering, should we reopen in the fall? How do we continue in the academic year? What lessons can U.S. higher education institutions learn from Duke University's China campus as they develop strategies through education to get us through this period?
Okay, so we were very fortunate in that when the virus started to spread in China, we had started to hear rumors, and then we started to hear government delivered information that this was becoming a problem. And so we quickly created an emergency task force, and we went into full lockdown on the campus. And it seemed very harsh and severe at the time, but it turned out to be probably one of the best decisions that we made. And in particular, we made a decision to evacuate our students. And so out of those students living on campus, we basically ended up with about 60 students left after we evacuated the international students, the students from within the mainland, and then students from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. And we were able to get most of them back home safely, and many of them still remain in place in that location. I think the fact that we were very quick to take action was very important. I think the fact that our emergency task force worked extremely well. We had a very good division of labor. Our Chinese colleagues did most of the interfacing with the Chinese government, and that was at the city level, the provincial level, and at the national level. And the American colleagues and other international staff members interacted largely with Duke to make sure that we were getting a steady flow of information from the international media, from the US side, so that we were really comfortable that our actions were reflecting the reality on the ground. So whatever information gaps might have existed on the Chinese side, we tried to make up for those by getting contacts in a number of different venues along with Duke. For example, we were speaking on a regular basis to the US consulate, the US embassy, as well as to AmCham in Shanghai. So through all of these multiple sources, we were comparing notes, and we were fortunate enough that our actions were reflective of the concrete situation that was emerging, and saved us from, a potential mess on the campus. I'm happy to report that at the end of the day, so far, based on what we know, we have not had one report of anyone from Duke Kunshan University becoming ill because of COVID-19.
And when let me move to you. Tell me a bit about VIP Kid, and what does the company do? How does it work?
Thank you, Shannon. And apologies for the tech issue in the beginning. It's hard to follow Dennis after his decades of experience in China and having so much knowledge about China's education sector. VIP Kid is a really interesting education technology company. We care about education, but we use technology and the technology platform to make teaching and learning and interaction more easily. So we were founded in 2013 by Cindy Nee, a young women entrepreneur who started the company really just 6 years ago. And today we've grown the company to to have actually students and teachers, the numbers I'll share later, to really connect on the platform for English immersive learning. So it's one-on-one live English language learning. So right now we have 100,000 teachers from North America and 700,000 students, primarily from China, but they really come from everywhere in the world. We also have a Chinese product, Lingo Bus, that goes in the opposite direction. So Chinese teachers teaching kids globally for a Chinese Mandarin, and primarily from North America as well. So you can see that the platform through technology has been able to connect teachers and students for language learning, and on a scale that's unprecedented. Some more numbers to share. Every day we have 200,000 classes taking place online, and during peak hours is 35,000 classes taking place concurrently. So that's a little bit about VIP Kid.
Yeah. And how has the COVID-19 pandemic, how has it impacted your company's operations, and what lessons do you think can be drawn from your online model of learning for education during this time?
Yeah, obviously, given our business model, which, is really between US and China, when things started in January around Chinese New Year time in China, that's when we first saw schools closed. So the school closures also meant that students did not return to school. So remember, they were taking the Chinese New Year break, the winter break. So they were informed not to go back to school. And so what do? They have to take classes online. That's when we see a surge of demand for online education. And it's not just ours, it's not just our business, it's across the board. We find that, adult education as well. And so, because of that, we actually donated 1.5 million classes online. Is both math and English, especially for the students that are from Wuhan, which is the original place where this started, and also kids that are affected, if their parents are I would say care workers. And when we see that happening in the U.S. Well, actually, let me back up a little bit more. So during that time, what's really touching is how much our teachers actually wanted to help their students. So we received thousands of masks donated by teachers voluntarily because they care so much about their teachers. They want to make sure their students are being taken care of. And so when things happen in the United States, it comes in the opposite direction. Students and parents care so much about their teachers, so they want to send masks to the teachers. It's really touching to see those individual stories happening. They tape videos to cheer each other up. I remember especially watching a video from a 6-year-old student from Wuhan. And she was telling her teacher not to fear, not to worry, and together we can fight the virus. Hearing this from a 6-year-old girl gave me so much comfort. I'm sure that, had the same effect on her teacher as well, because if she was okay, we're gonna all be okay. We just have to do this together. So these are some of the things we're seeing, just the human stories and the bond between teachers and students, despite what's going on between the two governments. And the politics, I think this kind of human-to-human connection and stories is really shows just how strong, the connections are, and how important, I would say, we continue doing what we're doing. Of course, at the corporate level, I can share more just in terms of how we're supporting. The United States here as well. We made some donations to support New York to purchase medical supplies. We also, support California governor's partnership to support distance learning and to close the digital gap. Because, not everyone can get online. Not every teacher knows how to teach online, and not every student actually has the access to the internet to get online. So we really want to make sure that, this online education, is not going to further deepen the learning gap between the haves and the have-nots.
And now I have a question from one of the viewers, and he asks, is studying abroad becoming risky in the wake of the pandemic? Dennis, do you want to answer that? How has the pandemic impacted studying abroad? And can you also speak to any sort of how your use of technology has changed? How universities, both in the United States and China, might be using technology more over the next year to incorporate into their classrooms?
Sure. Well, of course, the study abroad, when you're sitting in a place like Duke Kunshan University, is a two-way proposition. We have American students coming to China, and we have Chinese students who are going to study at Duke in the United States. So we have the two-edged problem. And of course, they both now face a great deal of uncertainty. Everyone wants to know whether or not the U.S. campuses are going to reopen in the fall, and if they reopen, how are they going to reopen? Will it be largely online, or will it be some hybrid form of delivery with some classes being taught face-to-face and some classes being taught online? And the same thing now, as you know, there's a travel restriction for non-Chinese passport holders coming back to China. No one knows how long that's going to last. And so everyone is now starting to plan not only their plan A, but also some plan B of some other form of exposure to international that they might have. One of the nice things that has come out of this, for example, is the possibility that in the fall, if in fact Duke doesn't open as normal, they've said to students from China who've been admitted to Duke and we're going to go to Durham, that they might start the semester on the DKU campus in Kunshan. That would give them the opportunity more than likely to have a face-to-face delivery, though they still might take some classes being taught by Duke faculty back from the Durham location. So we're going to see a mix and match kind of a menu being put in place for these students. But I think one thing is really important to understand. A lot of people in the past looked at online versus face-to-face as parts of two separate options. And I think what we've learned during this period of the COVID-19 is that actually these technologies ought to be used more in tandem. That the use of Zoom and WebEx and other related technologies and softwares can be integrated very well into the fabric of a face-to-face delivery and could even strengthen that learning experience for students. And this is no longer, as they say, your father's Oldsmobile. It's no longer the old style of online, which was one way, not very interactive and not very engaging for the students. Now with these technologies like Microsoft Teams, for example, we're able to engage students in group projects and make them feel that they are part of some kind of larger phenomena rather than feeling totally isolated in their homes or wherever they're taking their classes. This is a big sea change, and I think that the days of treating technology as an option or icing on the cake rather than the cake itself, I think that's gonna change as a result of COVID-19.
So Wenxi, let me turn to you a different topic. Chinese technology firms, as I mentioned, are under a lot of scrutiny in the US. And I want to know from you, do you see Chinese tech companies having a harder time in the US gaining trust from stakeholders? And what are the challenges for VIP Kid and companies like yours in this current era of China-US relations?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly if you look at, what is being debated and discussed, especially from Washington, D.C. and what's written in the media these days, there's a lot of question about Chinese technology companies. I think the good thing about us is that we are really an education company. And, if you look at our business model, we have 100,000 North American teachers. That really makes us a both U.S. and a Chinese company in that sense. In terms of challenges, I would just say, are you referring to more of the political challenges? For us, of course, running any business, there are all kinds of challenges. I think from my point of view, the greatest challenge is really navigating, what's being discussed at the top level and make sure that we're not being caught in the unnecessary political discussions. Because ultimately, VIP Kids' mission is really to empower and educate every child for the future. How can we do this if, education for K-12 students becomes a political issue? I think that is a huge problem for, both of our countries. And I don't think anyone wants to see that. I have to say, when I joined the company a couple of years ago, and I would never thought that, education would become an issue. And I'm glad to report that so far it still hasn't become an issue, at least from what we're seeing from VIP Kids for K-12 education.
And Dennis, what are you seeing in the world of higher education? How have these security issues and the current state of Sino-US ties, how are they impacting higher education from where you sit?
So these are major issues, and Wenchi is exactly right. It used to be that education and science and technology cooperation were so-called protected spheres, that even when the political relationship was in a turbulent state, we were able, through people-to-people diplomacy, to sustain those connections, and relationships among American and Chinese scientists, among educators, maintain their strength during these periods of political difficulty. But over the last 24, 36 months, that entire situation has changed. And in particular, the questions that have been raised about theft of IP know-how, questions that have been raised about the activities of some visiting scholars. And of course, one of the dangers here is that, you got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that you may have found a couple of nefarious characters out there doing inappropriate actions, but by far the bulk of the scholars that have coming to the United States, and the scholars from the United States going to China, are all basically going for academic purposes, and they have no ill will or bad intentions. And I don't think the record indicates by any means that somehow we have a major national security threat the way that has been painted, I think, sometimes in the media. Yes, I would agree 100%. U.S. universities need to step up their game in terms of understanding who's coming on their campus, what those people are doing, and having a broader understanding of the experience of these people, whether they're staying on campus, going off campus, and also having greater accountability. For example, if somebody is there in Chinese Jiadai, their receiving person, that person should be accountable for the activities of these scholars. But that said, I think that the scholarly exchanges between the two countries have been an important part of building trust, of building cross-cultural understanding, and also have contributed in some very fundamental ways to cross-cultural learning in the education sphere. It would not have been imaginable in the early 80s to think that we could have a joint venture university like Duke Kunshan University teaching liberal arts education in the middle of China. It just was unfathomable at the time. But the Ministry of Education, to its credit, and to its commitment to improve Chinese higher education, basically made the decision to allow several of these to come into existence. And I can say that based on my understanding of all of them, they've all done a pretty good job. They're all a little bit different. They all have a little bit different management structure, but they all seem to be working in their own way. Some are more financially viable than others. Some are larger, on a much larger scale, like Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool versus DKU, which is still rather small. But they all have this notion that they're breaking new ground. And I think that's something that we have to recognize, that even when the two governments are not speaking well of one another, the relationship among the American people and the Chinese people can still be very good. And it reminds me, a couple of years back, Madam Liu Yendong, who's the former vice premier, was visiting the United States during her final visit, and she made a speech at Columbia University in which she mentioned just how important it was that even in the heat of the tensions between the two countries, that the American education system and Chinese education systems remain fully engaged with one another. So I'm hoping that this is a short-term phenomena, that in fact that we fill up the gaps and the patches where improvements do need to take place. And then finally, there may be some opportunities to do some exciting things here, like, for example, to create a code of conduct between the US universities and Chinese universities, where they each agree to a code of behavior that will lay out, in a sense, the rules of the game, the moral and ethical principles that should guide these kind of exchanges, and that both countries, through their universities, make a commitment. I think this is something that we could do at the university level that would turn out to be a very productive experience for both countries, and it's something that we ought to begin to explore.
Wenju, let me go back to you. What, with the teachers and the students who are using VIP Kid, what are the things that have surprised them? And also, I was really interested in something that you said, that your company does some work or a lot to address the issue of inequality of education. When I was in China, I reported on schools in the countryside, and of course there are big disparities in the level of education available to different people. So how does your company address those challenges or issues?
Yeah, first of all, in terms of the equality or inequality issue, this is where we truly believe that technology can solve this problem. We have a signature program. It's called Rural Education Project that started about 3 years ago. So we wanted to bring this kind of American teacher teaching English live to the classrooms in rural schools. And today we're very proud to report that we've reached over 50,000 students in over 1,000 rural schools in China. And this is only made possible because of technology. So that kind of program, or what we would say social impact program, is going to continue to grow, and we want to do that. And what's really touching again and moving is to see how enthusiastic American teachers really want to participate in this. And we have way more teachers who want to teach those classes than the slots we can provide. And because of that, we want to grow that program in the United States as well, because we know rural schools and rural students also have access issues. And so we actually launched a nonprofit organization, a US nonprofit organization. It's called VIP Teach, about a year ago, to also address some of the access issue, as well as to really focus on the professional development of online educators. What we have found over the last few years of being in the United States, being in the online education space, is that we simply don't have enough online educators, and this is even more pronounced during the time during COVID. So the nonprofit's professional development program for online educators, we're going to launch a program. It's called Global Online Teaching Fellowship, the first of its kind that will focus on virtual and service-oriented teaching opportunity for future education leaders. So some of the things that we're doing really are really laying the ground for the future, whether it's for educators in terms of professional development, or for kids who are in rural areas who will otherwise not have the opportunity.
Okay. Dennis, one thing I wanted to ask you is about the financial ties between China and the US, educational ties. And what I mean by that is the number of students from mainland China studying in American universities has risen greatly, increased by more than 50% over the last decade. They've become a key source. Chinese students are a key source of tuition revenue and talent now in American colleges. And can you tell me how the current tensions between the US and China, how is that impacting American universities' bottom line?
Okay. So U.S. universities, they want Chinese students just like they want other international students, because internationalization of education is very much part of the strategic positioning of most American universities. They believe that the The learning environment is enhanced by the presence of students and faculty, for that matter, who come from different parts of the world and can bring different perspectives into the classroom and also outside the classroom. And so I think it's extremely important to recognize that despite some of the noise with COVID-19 and words like, the Chinese virus, et cetera, U.S. universities remain extremely committed to having international students. And to be blunt, it's not just about the money. The financial aspect of it is important. Chinese students contribute to the U.S. economy several billions of dollars every year, from everything from the tuitions that they pay, to the goods and services that they purchase, to the travel that they do within the country. They are clearly an important economic catalyst in many communities and on many campuses. But that said, there also is an important role that they play in bringing with them the perspective of right now the second largest economy in the world, soon to be probably the first largest economy in the world. But it's very important that the United States and China understand one another, and the way that all begins is with young people. The way it begins is with the dialogues that get forged in classrooms and in social settings among university students and even sometimes high school students, where Americans need to hear the perspective of their Chinese colleagues, and the Chinese colleagues need to be exposed to the perspectives of their American friends. The one thing that the U.S. universities have to do a better job of in terms of attracting Chinese students is making sure that it's not just about selling a brand of a famous university and getting the students to come. They must do a better job of integrating these students into the mainstream of campus life and the education experience. There are too many Chinese students that unfortunately come to the U.S. and they more or less have a Chinese experience on a U.S. campus. They don't interact very much with a large number of non-Chinese students. They speak, when they're not in the classroom, they're speaking Chinese most of the day. When they go socializing, they're going to Chinese movies. When they're eating Chinese food. And I'm embellishing a bit, but my point being is that it would be nice if they went out for pizza and a beer with some of their colleagues and get to know one another and pick up on some of these different controversial issues and not be afraid to talk about them for fear of being, criticized socially, or that their English is not good enough or something like that. And so this is a critical part, not just as I said, for the financial contribution, but really if U.S. universities want to become truly globalized, they must do a more thorough job of understanding how their education environments can be further enhanced by the presence of these students from all around the world.
And I have a follow-up question from a viewer who says, do you expect that the number of Chinese students who wish to seek higher education in the U.S. will sharply decline because of the current deteriorating Sino-U.S. relations? And that's for Dennis.
So unfortunately, I think there will be some impact of what's gone on. To be perfectly blunt, every time there's a shooting in the United States and some violent incident on some U.S. campus or at some school in some community, this sends shudders, down the spine of Chinese parents who are afraid for their kids and are not excited about their kids coming into a country that has, in some places, a gun culture. And I think that this is something that we need to take stock of, not only for our own interests, but also how international visitors see us. The COVID-19, to be really blunt, I've experienced this now on both sides of the Pacific. I was in Kunshan in early January and saw the onset of COVID-19, and then in early February I returned to the United States and saw the spread of COVID-19 in the U.S. And I have to say, despite the bumps that occurred in Wuhan in the first couple of weeks of all of this happening, the Chinese system actually has worked. Today, I can go outside in Shanghai and I can go to restaurants, I can go to department stores, I can get in taxis. People are wearing masks. but life is steadily getting back to normal in a way that it's very hard to imagine the U.S. will be at that point unless it's just a number of months, down the line. So my sense is that Chinese parents will want their kids to stay at home, and having options like these joint venture universities are going to be one form in which I think they're going to start to think about in a larger way. We've already seen, for example, that we're getting a number of phone calls about the possibility of transferring students. And I know some of the other universities, joint venture universities, have gotten the same kind of inquiries about transfer. So these are things that clearly are on the minds of Chinese parents. And I really sincerely hope that this discussion about disengagement or creating greater distance, and I don't mean just social distance, but greater distance doesn't result in a sharp decline. I really do believe that the two-way flow of students between the both countries is an important building block for hopefully overcoming some of this long-term mistrust and uneasiness that has continued to plague the relationship over the longer term. And it's unfortunate that now it's been allowed to magnify itself because of something like COVID-19.
Wenqi, I have a question from a viewer for you, Bill Kwong. He says, VIP Kids has been very popular, but he asks, with strong anti-Chinese sentiment that he says is now in existence in the US, and you've spoken to this a little bit, but with just the dynamics right now between US-China ties, do you see that and perhaps growing xenophobia or suspicion in the United States of China? Do you see that impacting VIP Kids, or what role do you see VIP Kids playing in these dynamics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If anything, I would say our role is even more important, because what we find is that our platform really has become a two-way education classroom. So it's not just American teachers teaching Chinese kids English. The Chinese students and parents have been teaching their teachers so much about Chinese culture and everything. One example I wanted to give is just, before COVID-19, we always would convene regional conferences for our teachers because they all teach online, and once in a while they really want to connect with their peers and learn from each other. And one of the most, if not the most popular session is always about Chinese culture, because their students, they are so interested in calligraphy, they're interested in what they're drinking. They're all well aware of all the Chinese holidays. They're very, very in sync with all the popular memes, because their students will teach them. A lot of them I hadn't even heard of. This is how much of the kind of person-to-person cultural learning that is taking place. So it is really happening two-way. So, it also gives us the opportunity to really clear a lot of the misunderstandings from each other. So I can say that, when COVID-19 really sort of became an issue, that also, gives us the opportunity to educate a lot of our teachers, for example, be culturally sensitive when you are referring to the virus, right? So Dennis mentioned, whether it's framing it as a Chinese virus or Wuhan virus, these are the terms that teachers read from their newspaper. Obviously, if they listen to what our president used to say at that time, I don't think they intentionally do that or hold any discriminatory kind of sentiment. So it also allows us the opportunity to tell them, hey, let's be culturally sensitive, watch out where you're saying, and teachers understand it. Likewise, the opposite direction, there used to be how Chinese parents discipline their children, may be culturally different. So that also gives us, as a platform, the opportunity to educate a lot of the parents in a very culturally appropriate and nuanced and creative way, to let them know that, you know, American teachers do not like, you know, maybe wouldn't appreciate this particular type of disciplinary style. So, you know, I think this kind of, again, the platform has allowed both sides to see really, you know, different cultures, whether it's what you would consider something you want to learn from or something you may not want to learn from, but at least it allows us to see both sides, and then, you know, we can really find a way to appreciate, if not to criticize or pass on judgment.
Shannon, can I add something to this
Yeah, sure.
point? At the university campuses around the United States, it was very clear that once terms like Wuhan virus and Chinese virus were invoked, there was evidence of bias and racial discrimination, and I can say that I'm really proud of the Duke President Vincent Price. Very early on in this whole endeavor, he made a major statement to the Duke campus that basically condemned in the strongest terms any kind of examples of racial discrimination. And Duke has an Office of Institutional Equity, and that office was notified that it should be prepared to receive anonymously or openly any kind of reports of cases of this kind of discrimination. Duke also has a Center for Multicultural Affairs that deals with the role of Asians and Asian Americans among all of the other ethnicities in the United States. And they also made a very pronounced statement about condemning this kind of activity. I think many of the university presidents in the United States did this, and that was probably one of the most important reasons that kept a lid on some of this and kept it from spinning out of control, because there was some verbiage being used at the White House and coming out of DC that was not appropriate, and basically was being felt in a hurtful way among the members of the Asian community in the US. And it was important to nip this in the bud, and I applaud those presidents really that took that action, made those statements, and let everyone know that type of behavior was unacceptable. And we need more kinds of university presidents standing up for these kinds of against these kinds of behaviors, because it is important not to let these things even fester for a moment, because they really have the potential to spin out of control if they're not arrested very, very early on.
Dennis, I have a follow-up question for you. It's well, it's not really a follow-up, it's unrelated, but how has Duke dealt with this issue of academic freedom? I mean, there have been reports, of course, from China that there have been curbs on free speech and academic freedom in the last few years. How does Duke deal with that on its campus?
Okay, well, probably the question I get most often as the executive vice chancellor is about academic freedom. And so let me say a couple of things. First, before this venture was even established, there were multiple years of negotiation going on, and one of the things that we created was something called a cooperative education agreement. And within that cooperative education agreement, there is a very hefty section that talks about the issues of academic freedom. And that entire document, the CEA, was signed off on by the Chinese side from the Ministry of Education and from the Duke side. And so therefore we have a document in place. It's a contractual obligation that guarantees that within the framework of the Chinese law, the campus will have unencumbered academic freedom. And so that's an important starting point for this. The second thing to understand is that were we to have a situation on the DKU campus where we didn't have equivalency in terms of the academic learning environment, in other words, students were constrained from speaking, or students couldn't access certain materials, etc., then we would not be able to be in a position from an accreditation point of view to issue a Duke University degree. And as you know, we issued 2 degrees, one from Duke Kunshan University and one from Duke University. And the Duke degree is an accredited degree. It's accredited by SACS, the same accrediting agency that accredits the Duke degree that's given in Durham, North Carolina. And so, putting aside any kind of political, perspective, there is simply, from an educational perspective, a requirement that academic freedom be maintained if only to achieve equivalency. But let's just talk now about the reality of things. There come along a series of sensitive issues all the time. The demonstrations in Hong Kong, the situation in Xinjiang, how the COVID-19 is being handled. All of these kinds of things are, recipes for there to be tensions between the two sides that go all the way down to the classroom. And I have faculty who are always asking me, EVC Simon, what can we talk about? What are the limits? What are the parameters? And I basically say, look, if it's within the purview of your academic purposes for being in the classroom, if it's within the framework of what you need to expose the students to help them understand, then there is no limit. Basically, you need to go about and do your thing. And one of the things that we have done is we've taken the cell phone out of the classroom. The cell phone, in terms of being able to record video or recording audio, is a very potentially dangerous instrument. And sometimes it creates some kind of self-censorship in the classroom. So we very early on did 2 things. We took the cell phone out of the classroom. You can't record your colleagues or the professor, what they say. The same thing for conferences. And second of all, we have Chatham House rules that you may be able to quote a speaker like a senior person at DKU, but you can't say Dennis Simon said this, or Mr. Wong said that, or Miss Lee said this. And that has given the students a greater deal of comfort in being able to articulate opinions, share ideas, and even step outside the box in many cases about voicing an opinion. But I can tell you there are pressures. There are pressures from among the students themselves, looking over somebody's shoulder here and there. But on the whole, I'm actually quite pleased. And the best indication of this is that the National Committee for U.S.-China Relations every year has a town hall meeting that they hold throughout the United States. And most recently, they've been holding them in China at the kinds of JV campuses. We've had an open door policy. We've held I think 3 of the last 4 years. We've held them. They've been extremely successful, and we have had nobody try to curtail what was said, who was speaking, or any of the dialogue that went on. The door was open. We even invited officials from Kunshan and Suzhou to attend the meeting. One year, Henry Kissinger was the speaker. One year, Condoleezza Rice was the speaker. And they don't always have a totally pro-China views on every issue. And so, we've been allowed to, and no one has ever come onto our campus and basically said, that book's no good. That topic, that class can't be taught. And so I think that, when all is said and done, we operate within the framework of the law. The law sometimes in China is shifting a little bit. We go through periods of tight control and looser control. As you remarked, we are now in a period where control is a little bit more tighter. And under the current Chinese leadership, more people are feeling a little bit constrained about their degrees of freedom in articulating some perspectives. But on the whole, I'm very comfortable with where we are. Again, unimaginable to have the kind of discussions about contemporary China in our classrooms that we are having today on a regular basis. So a few years ago, it was the unthinkable, and we're here doing it. So without over exaggerating, the Ministry of Education and the Jiangsu Education Department who oversee us, they deserve great credit for having the willingness to abide by their agreement and allow us to go forward in the way that we have in this kind of productive manner.
Okay, thank you. So Wenqi, I'll ask you one final question here. Your background, you have a background in the State Department, and I wanted to ask you, related to that, what kind of foundation do the educational exchanges provided through VIP Kid and also maybe through higher education, what do you, with your background in government and diplomacy, what kind of bridges do these exchanges build, and what sort of impact have you seen? Wenxi, you're on mute.
One of the reasons I really wanted to join VIP Kid a couple years ago was purely because of the potential and the possibility I'm seeing in this business. The kind of connection and the scale it brings to connect the two countries' people, especially the next generation, is simply unprecedented. Having worked in the State Department and knowing that, State Department also runs a lot of those international exchange programs. And the State Department is always very proud of those exchange programs because they're cultivating the next generation of leaders. So many alumni of those programs become, future country leaders and, business leaders, policy or, whichever field it is. But the most important thing is they have experience with American culture, knowing American people. So that kind of mutual understanding is so important, vice versa in the opposite direction. So I think what we're building is something truly long-term and fundamental. And what the issues that are happening and on our platform are also the issues that are also happening between our countries on a daily basis. So if we could solve the problems between an American teacher from Missouri and a student from, Sichuan, Chongqing, I think, those lessons can really be learned at a government level, at the business level. So this is why I'm very, very hopeful for this kind of exchange. And regardless, we do see that the two countries' people have this strong desire to connect and learn from each other, despite the high level politics. And you see that among young children, you see that among, university students from both countries. I think this is, what gives us hope about the future.
Thanks so much. Well, this wraps it up. As you mentioned, these educational exchanges build bridges, and it's a crucial chapter right now in Sino-US ties with many implications for the economy, the fallout from the pandemic, and international security. Thanks so much for joining the US-China series, and thank you so much, Wenxi and Dennis, for joining me this hour. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.